It's been just over a year since I first rode my Specialized Stumpjumper, and today I'm going to share my thoughts on the bike. For anybody looking for the 2020 model, this is the 2019 model, which is basically the exact same bike. I think you can even get the same colorway, but this particular bike has had quite the year. I've taken it all over BC, including the Whistler Bike Park, taken it to Quebec, New Hampshire, New York, Vermont, and less aggressive trails close to home here in Toronto, Ontario. The Stumpjumper is available in quite a few options. It's actually a little bit confusing, but this is a Stumpjumper Carbon Comp 29er long travel. Now the only difference between the frame on the short travel model and the long travel model is the length of the yoke used to connect the rear triangle to the front triangle. So the bikes actually ride quite the same. So rather than get into part specs and all that today, I'm just going to talk about the general ride quality of the bike. So the first day I had this bike was a little bit crazy. I bought the bike, threw it in a box, threw it on a plane, and flew from Toronto to Vancouver. So I got it off the plane, put it together, raced over to the North Shore, and had my first ride on the bike. So how does the bike actually feel on the trail? Well, the first thing I noticed when I was pedaling up the fire road was that the bike pedals very efficiently, especially for the long travel model. My first actual downhill run on the bike was on a trail called Bobsled, and I was amazed at how the bike could stick to the ground and still be poppy at the same time. One of my main concerns switching from a giant Trance with 27.5-inch wheels to the Stumpy with 29-inch wheels was how the bike would jump. I wasn't exactly sure the bike would fly through the air exactly the way I liked it to. So the first gap jump I hit was on the bobsled trail, and one of my main concerns was that I would get bucked over the bars. So this is a pretty steep rock right here, and my main concern is that my rear wheel will kind of get kicked and I'll nosedive. Now the flying position actually was quite a bit different than the smaller wheels, but once I got used to the way the bike kicks off lips, I actually saw no handicap to having the bigger wheels and was actually casing jumps less often because the 29ers carry more speed into the jump. One of the most common questions I get about the Stumpy is how does it handle the Whistler Bike Park? It's actually the most popular video on my channel right now, probably because I got to crash test the bike pretty heavy that day. Oh, shit. But other than that crash, the bike handled the park very well, especially on flow trails. I really liked it on trails like A-Line and Dirt Merchant. The bike just goes so fast. The bike also did very well on the tech trails, but definitely the limiting factor on that one was the rider. I'm sure I would have done better on a downhill bike, but at no point did I feel limited by the Stumpy. So I think it would be a good time to mention that this bike does have a flip chip. Now the flip chip lowers the bottom bracket and slacks out the head angle to give the bike a more stable feel, but I've actually had the bike in high since the day I got it. And for me, I prefer to have a higher bottom bracket to avoid pedal strikes. And again, maybe on the tech trails, I would have been in a bit better shape if I had that lower setup. But for the most part, other than that crash, I felt pretty good even in the high setting. So during the rest of the trip to BC, the bike continued to perform very well. I ended up taking the bike on a lot of the same trails I took my downhill bike on in 2014, except I was able to pedal to the top. Now I don't want to give the wrong impression, it's definitely not a downhill bike. Where a downhill bike would kind of plow through chunky rock sections or roots, this thing sort of pops and dances its way through, and it's still fun, but it's just a different kind of fun. I want to get back to pedaling here for a second because this thing does it very well. On my second day in Whistler, I got to take this thing up a trail called Into the Mystic and down Lord of the Squirrels. This is the biggest climb I've ever done. And when you can take a bike with 29-inch wheels with 150 millimeters of front and rear wheel travel up that high into the mountains, it really opens up a world of possibilities for your riding. Now this trail had a pretty steady climb up, and I've noticed definitely since I've got it home on the punchier trails here in Ontario that the bike definitely feels a little bit slower when I'm going up those super steep climbs where you have to put down a lot of power. But anytime where you can keep even cadence on the pedals like a fire road or a less technical XC climb, the bike does very well, and I would imagine that the short travel model does very well in that punchier situation. So as I mentioned earlier, once I got back from out west, I took this thing out east. Now the difference between the west and the east is the west has bigger mountains, but out east, the rocks are gnarly. They're big, they're chunky, they're awkward, and they're everywhere. This bike was just floating over the rocks with those big wheels. Definitely the 29ers were shining out east. and 150 millimeters of travel was perfect, because out west where you'd get the big 45-minute descents, maybe you want a little bit of extra cushion just to get down the mountain, but 10-minute descents out east maximum. On these shorter descents, your body doesn't get as tired and you don't need quite as much travel. So you get to the bottom and you're ready to pedal back up to the top. By the end of the season, I was just sending it on every ride. This bike flies really well once you get used to it. Now, most people who are into sending big jumps would probably look at the Stumpy's bigger brother, the Specialized Enduro. And maybe if you were hitting like 40, 50-foot gaps, I would definitely go with that. But I hit quite a few 30-foot gap jumps on this thing, and even a couple 11 or 12-foot drops. At the 11 or 12-foot drop mark, I was probably on the edge of my capability with this bike, but certainly a better rider could take this thing off a 15-foot drop and it would be fine. So definitely not feeling limited when it comes to sending it on the Stumpy. It's super stable in the air. So over the winter, I didn't ride the bike, so that brings us back to now. And we've kind of had a late start to the season this year, so I've pretty much just been pedaling this thing around on the road. And basically one of the main reasons I bought this thing was because it's a big bike that pedals so well. And I've had a blast just pedaling around the city, popping manuals. This thing manuals very nice, it's got a short back end.
Let's get a little hill bomb going here. So now I really like how this thing manuals because it's so big, but with the short back end, it's easy to keep the front wheel in the air. Like, I'm just chilling right now. This hill's about to end. Yeah, keep it going. All right, I'll go over here.
This bike has been very good just for a commuter, believe it or not, as long as you have a place to lock it up, because yeah, it definitely attracts attention when you're riding around the city. Now, one thing I didn't ever expect to use was the SWAT box system on this bike. I honestly kind of thought it was a gimmick, but after I got my first flat tire, I started walking down the mountain, and halfway down the mountain, I forgot completely that I had a tube inside my SWAT box.
I totally forgot I have a tube in my SWAT box. Oh, I love this thing.
And I switched it over and I was sold. SWAT box system is awesome. I don't think I'd ever want to go without it again.
Just so stoked to be back on the bike and not walking right now.
So it's time to talk about some of the issues I've had with this bike over the year. And there hasn't been that many, but one of the main things that bummed me out was that I actually exploded the rear hub. Now, I definitely cased a few jumps, but definitely nothing that should blow up a rear hub. I remember spinning the rear wheel on, I think, the 7th day I had the bike, and the wheel came to a stop very quickly.
Sorry, Stumpy.
Now, I'm actually pretty sure that the hub was defective from the day I bought the bike. On my first run, I remember hearing some crunching noises coming from the rear wheel. Now, my assumption was that that was just spokes flexing because the wheels were new. But looking back, I'm pretty sure it was the rear hub. But this has actually turned out to be kind of a good experience in the end because Specialized customer service is fantastic. I'm not sponsored by Specialized, I'm just saying I brought my bike into my local bike shop, Cycle Path on the Danforth. They're great as well. They had the hub out that day, and within 3 days I had a new hub on my bike and the bike was ready to ride. I think I brought it in on a Wednesday and I was back on my bike by the weekend, so I missed 0 riding time. That was awesome. So like I said earlier, this bike does come in different wheel sizes. If you're somebody having trouble deciding between a 27.5 and a 29-inch wheel, first and foremost, consider your local terrain and riding style, but I know that this was a difficult decision for me. When I first demo rode the Stumpy, I actually forgot to ask the rep which size the wheels were, and I just assumed that they were 27.5s. I rode the bike and I loved it, but it wasn't until after the ride that I actually found out that they were 29ers. So I ended up buying the bike and I have no regrets because this thing is so fast, it's super stable, and it's really playful even with those big wheels. So that's it. Clearly, I love the bike. I could see myself maybe putting a few upgrades on the bike this summer, so stay tuned for that. But I don't see myself buying an entirely new bike unless maybe a hardtail were to make its way into my life. But I think that's a whole different video. So until then, ride good trails.